You can master any camera by simply understanding the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle consists of 3 legs. First, you have your aperture, then you have your shutter speed, and then finally, you have your ISO. Let's dive into it a bit deeper. Your aperture is measured in f-stops, and it references how wide or how closed off the iris of your lens is. When someone mentions a lens being wide open, they mean that it is down to the lowest f-stop possible for that lens. That could be a 1.2 or 2.8 or even a 4.0 in some cases. The thing to remember about this is that the lower the number, the wider the iris, which means the more amount of light that would be allowed into your camera, which also will result in a brighter image. Conversely, the higher the number, the darker the image, the less light is allowed into your camera. The aperture also controls whether you have a shallow depth of field or a blurry background, or if more of your image will be in focus. Your shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, and it represents how long or the length of time that your sensor will be able to capture light. This is also responsible for the amount of motion blur that you will see in your image. Videography is quite literally motion pictures. So in that instant, our actual goal is to get the most natural motion blur that is possible. The general rule of thumb to capture the most natural motion blur is to shoot at twice your frame rate. So if you are shooting at 24 frames per second, for instance, your shutter speed should be at 1/48, but with most cameras, you would have to settle for 1/50 or 1/60. Conversely, if you are shooting at 60 frames per second, your shutter speed needs to be at 1/125 in order to capture that same motion blur. It is also worth noting that the higher your shutter speed, the darker your image. The lower your shutter speed, the brighter your image. The last leg of this exposure triangle is your ISO, or your ISO. Now, your ISO measures how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. So the higher this number is, the brighter your image will be because the more sensitive your sensor is. However, the lower the number, the darker your image will be because your sensor will then be less sensitive to that light. Now, it is also worth noting that the higher your ISO, the greater your chance of running into grain or having digital noise in your image, those little white specks. Generally speaking, you will want to stay on your camera's base ISO, which will be the optimal ISO for your camera, and it will give you the most dynamic range in your image. Now, before I go on to give you some quick tips for when you are getting started and using your camera and understanding this exposure triangle, if you've been finding value so far in this video, do me a favor and tap that like button so we can get this video in front of more people. Some quick tips before I let you go is 1, when you're first starting out, your best bet is to stay right at your base ISO so you can have the greatest dynamic range and get the cleanest image out of your camera. 2, do not forget to keep your shutter speed at twice your frame rate. And remember, the higher up you go, the darker your image will be. So if you are looking to create something with a little slow-mo or shooting at 60 frames per second or even 120 frames per second, you might need some extra light in order to maintain that natural motion blur. Finally, when it comes to your aperture, understand this is the only leg of the triangle that you can actually maneuver to your creative likings, and you should do so with confidence. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I hope that you feel as if this was a good use of your time. I'll see you on the next one, and as usual, it's all love.